Hello, I am Steve Wood, and thank you for joining us on Luke 21 as we study biblical prophecy. And we're in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We're spending time in this chapter because it's probably one of the key chapters regarding the end times according to biblical teaching. And just to review what we've learned so far, in 2 Thessalonians 2, St. Paul says, "Don't be deceived or misled by anyone that the coming of the Lord, the parousia, the second coming, will be preceded by two events, namely, the great rebellion or apostasy or falling away, however you want to describe it, and the rise of the Antichrist. These two things happen before the parousia, the coming of the Lord." And if you look in the Revised Standard Version or a lot of other English versions, when you see coming in both 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, that's that word parousia, and before it, these two events occur. Now, there's a lot of people will tell you they will not occur before the second coming. St. Paul says, don't be deceived because they do need to occur. What I want to discuss today is what empowers the great apostasy? What's the key to the force behind it? And along with that, I want to try to underscore that this is something that we all need to be aware of. Why is that? Well, St. Paul and Jesus both warned of a great falling away in the end times. And it's going to be a strong delusion. It's very easy as a Christian to say, well, I've got that. I'm not going to be deceived by any end time deceptions or falling away. But if Jesus himself and St. Paul warns Christians about these events, we should pay attention. It's difficult to comprehend just how powerful this time, the great falling away, would be. And if we look behind the scenes as what empowers it, then I think we might get an appreciation for the power we're facing. Let's start with the book of Revelation and bring that to bear what's being discussed in 2 Thessalonians 2. In the book of Revelation, chapter 20, key chapter in the book of Revelation, starting with the first verse, it reads, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be let out for a little while." Now, it's tough going through sequentially these different passages in Scripture because we haven't really gone through the book of Revelation together in this new series. We're only in 2 Thessalonians. But Revelation 20 is really key because what it's describing is that the first coming of Christ, as a result of Christ's coming, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, his atoning death and sacrifice, what will happen is that Satan will lose a very specific power, not all power, but a specific power for 1,000 years. And in the book of Revelation, numbers very often are symbolic. It's just a way of saying a real long time, the Christian age. But what power specifically does this binding, having been thrown into the pit, engage? It says that he should deceive the nations no more. That's a purpose clause. This whole event of putting Satan, after the first coming of Christ, in the pit, that he can't deceive the nations, is that there's a problem that existed before Christ came, in that the world, apart from the nation Israel, and they kept imitating the nations surrounding them, as a huge mistake, but basically the world was enveloped in darkness before Christ came. And there's an Old Testament scripture that's actually repeated in the New Testament It's from Isaiah 9 that describes the situation in the world and what would happen with the coming of Christ. Isaiah 9 says, "There will be no gloom for her that was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the later time he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined." Now, what happened? In the 8th century BC, the wicked, pagan, brutal, pitiless nation Assyria, actually it was an empire, conquered the northern part of Israel. And what they did, amongst other things, is that they deported all the key leaders, the priests, the physicians, the teachers, the leading business people, and led them off into Assyria. It was a long march. They put a hook in your mouth or your nose and led you out. There was no stragglers. You had fish hooks in your mouth. And when you got to Assyria, you were basically thrust into the middle of pagan darkness. And that was only half the plan of Assyria. They brought Assyrians, pagans, and transported them to Israel. So there was this mix so that the nation Israel basically had a total collapse of both faith and culture. And this is the darkness that this area of Israel is described in Isaiah 9, and it's repeated in Matthew chapter 4 when Jesus went there saying he's seen a great light. But prior to Christ's coming, it says it was a land of deep darkness. Well, what's described in the first few verses of Revelation 20 speaks of a reversal of that deep darkness. In other words, Satan is bound. Doesn't mean that there's not activity of Satan tempting people to sin and all that type of thing. It's very specific that this darkness that was over the nations prior to the coming of Christ will be bound. It will become ineffective for a long time. And why do we know that's true? Well, the Great Commission would never have been successful. St. Paul would have never had 3 successful missionary journeys around the Roman Empire. Why? Because the forces of spiritual darkness would have kept people from seeing and believing in the great light. And because you had this great growth of Christianity throughout the world as a result of Satan's binding. But that's not all of it, because we're coming now to what fuels the great apostasy. And we're back to Revelation 20 because there's a second chapter in this discussion. Revelation 20 and verse 7 says, "And when the 1,000 years were ended," and again, we're just going real fast here, but the 1,000 years ending towards the very end of this age in which we are living, Satan will be released from his prison and go out to deceive the nations that are at the 4 corners of the earth, that is, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. In other words, the first binding resulted in the inability to deceive the nations, to blind the nations from seeing the truth of Israel's God and Israel's Messiah, Jesus Christ. But when the 1,000 years are ended, he's released, he's loosed, and he's able to do what he did before, and it's effective because those who are deceived among the nations of the world are as the sand of the seashore in their numbers, coming up and attacking probably a remnant of Christians that are not deceived about what is going on. That's why St. Paul, a little later in 2 Thessalonians 2, after describing this great rebellion, this great falling away, it says, with the coming of the Antichrist, the work of Satan and these demonic beings, it'll be a strong delusion. And when it says strong delusion, it means strong delusion that people will be deceived. That it's like the world will be darkened again. And another way of expressing this is in Revelation chapter 9, basically describing the same thing in Revelation 20. It says, when the fifth angel blew his trumpet, I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given a key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. That's where Satan was bound. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke of the shaft. In other words, a darkening, an apocalyptic darkening takes place worldwide. And things have changed a lot, not for the better culturally and faith-wise in our world in the last couple of decades. And you think, how could it possibly get worse? Well, there's no bottom. When the rheostat is turned down, in fact, off, and the darkening goes worldwide, you really need to have access to the light, namely the scriptures, to be able to discern what is going on. And remember, St. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. In other words, this darkness might be called enlightenment. This darkness might be called progressiveness. This darkness might be called technological marvels, and all the while, the darkening is taking place. Here's a really good book written by an Anglican priest who became a Catholic priest. He was the son of the Archbishop of Canterbury, so when he converted, it was a pretty big deal. And he's written this book entitled The Lord of the World, and it's a novel set in around the year 2000, and he describes something on page 302. He says, what surprised him was the density of the air. It was now, as old books related, it had been in the days of smoke. There was no freshness, no translucence of morning atmosphere. It was impossible to point in any one direction to the source of this veiling gloom. For on all sides it was the same. It was a sense of veiled unreality. This is what's coming on the world that St. Paul was warning about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So when he says there's going to be a falling away, a great rebellion, or a great apostasy, and it will involve a strong delusion, it will. It will be like the days before Christ. Worldwide, it was effective, except for the nation Israel, and they fell themselves into darkness. So what we want to do is heed these passages and look exactly what St. Paul says, because there's a lot of people who are expecting to go to heaven without having to endure the great falling away, without having to endure the gloom, the darkness, because St. Paul says that's one of the two signs that precede the parousia, the coming of Christ. I'm Steve Wood, your host, and thanks for joining us on Luke 21. Our Luke21.com website is now live. Please pay us a visit.